All right, we're rolling, friends. All right. This is episode 6.
Yep, episode 6.
Episode 6 of the Rising Tide podcast. So we got a lovely program for y'all today. We're going to be talking about Minneapolis. We're going to be talking about the United Educators of San Francisco gearing up for a strike. Then we're going to be talking about U.S. aggression abroad, talking about Venezuela, Iran, a little bit of Cuba, and some Greenland.
A lot of exciting stuff.
A lot of exciting. So let's just get into it with our little introduction today. Hi, I'm Dayton Du Bois, your host, co-host.
Dale Smith.
Awesome. So the little tie-in for this episode is Rising Tide of U.S. Imperialism. So we're 32 days into 2026, and the United States has already seized Venezuelan oil and sovereignty. Rising unrest in Iran has left open the possibility of further U.S. intervention in the region. Not even the archipelago of Greenland is safe from U.S. overreach. Meanwhile, in the United States, the boomerang of imperialism swings back onto nonviolent demonstrators, legal observers, mothers, friends, and allies. Keith Porter Jr., Renee Good, and Alex Pretty are just some of the most recent martyrs in the struggle here in the belly of the beast. In response to these ICE killings, the masses of Minneapolis are again rising up against the police state. Minneapolis, a city known as the flashpoint of the George Floyd uprising, is once again at the center of the class struggle here in the United States, and the conflict further exposes the truth that liberal elites and fascist executive state have nothing to offer the people in this fight against oppression. So, I don't know. We should probably just get into it a little bit with top down. I don't know how you want to get into this, Dale. We can start talking about Minneapolis, or you have some thoughts?
I think that's the thing that's been on a lot of people's minds, and it's the thing that's showing up in a lot of people's feeds, rightfully so. Let's just talk a little bit about Minneapolis. So for those that have been or haven't been paying attention, this past month there's been a series of protests in Minneapolis aimed at ICE after the federal government initiated what they deemed, quote-unquote, Operation Metro Surge, which would send thousands of federal immigration agents into the city to wreak havoc. This surge was largely due to the dishonest investigation done by failed YouTuber turned right-wing grifter Nick Shirley, who claimed to uncover the largest fraud scheme in U.S. history. His investigation was really a thinly veiled attack on Somalians and conveniently ignored the basic facts that A, there have been many businesses in Minneapolis that have been under investigation for fraud since the previous Trump administration, and B, there was no mention of the head of the $250 million scheme led by Amy Bach, the white woman in charge of feeding our future. Allies of the current presidential administration ran with the narrative Shirley created, and it was used as a justification for possibly the largest surge we've seen during either term of President Trump. So this has led to just chaos within the Twin Cities, with thousands of people being arrested. At least 150 of these people have been protesters who are U.S. citizens. As tensions have risen, it's also most notably led to people being shot by ICE agents, which resulted in the deaths of both 37-year-old Renee Good and 37-year-old Alex Pretty in separate incidents that went viral due to their murders being caught on camera. Their deaths account for 2 of the 7 shooting deaths that have been perpetrated by ICE within the past year, and that's at least 7 shooting deaths. That's what we know about. However, it's important to note that these are not the only people who have died within the past month due to ICE. So some of the other names of people we know are 43-year-old Keith Porter, who was killed by an off-duty ICE agent on New Year's Eve in Los Angeles. There was 55-year-old Geraldo Lunas Campos, who died in an ICE detention center. There was 36-year-old Victor Manuel Diaz, who died in ICE custody. There was 46-year-old Paradi La. He died in custody. There was 68-year-old Luis Beltran Yanez Cruz, who was denied essential medical care and passed away while being transferred to a hospital. And there was Herbert Sanchez Dominguez, who was 34 when he died in an ICE detention center, as well as Luis Gustavo Nunez Caceres, who was 42 when he passed away in a hospital after being denied by ICE the proper care. So these are just a few of the people that we know about that have died recently within the past month. And this list will no doubt continue to grow within the future. So these levels of violence are clearly a sign of what Martinique politician and author Aimé Césaire identified in his 1950 essay, Discourse on Colonialism, Essentially, it's the idea that imperialist governments develop repression techniques to control colonies abroad before eventually using them on their own population. This is commonly referred to as the imperialist boomerang. This is a clear sign of a capitalist society in decline. With growing social unrest and many people not buying into the scapegoat that the government and elites are creating by pointing fingers at immigrants and people who are quote unquote not American, in other words, non white people, they are employing repressive techniques used by the US Armed Forces abroad that have also been tested out by military forces like the IDF in Palestine. However, despite this increase in violence, we've seen an outpouring of solidarity within these past few weeks as well. The day before the execution of Preddy, there was a single-day general strike which led to tens of thousands of people flooding the streets of Minneapolis to support the economic blackout. This strike was organized by local faith leaders and was eventually sponsored by many labor unions. In response, solidarity actions sprung up all across the country in every major city in the United States. In the following days, Somali and Black student groups in Minnesota called for a single-day nationwide general strike on January 30th. This led to many organizations taking up the call, many under the banner of the larger coalition known as National Shutdown, which quickly amassed hundreds of endorsements from different organizations, nonprofits, and NGOs in short order. Despite the spontaneous nature of this general strike call and the protests that have arisen in response to violence by ICE in Minneapolis, overall, the level of resistance has nonetheless been inspiring. Most notably, companies like Target and Best Buy have been calling for a de-escalation for what is happening in Minnesota, which is clearly a sign that the social unrest is having an effect on their bottom line. Although rumors about Bovino being fired as well as ICE retreating remain unsubstantiated, it's clear that the government and corporations are feeling the heat in recent weeks. The recent outpouring of national support is also a positive sign. So on a local level, we've seen like the local nurses union as well as US, members of UASF talk about how interconnected their struggles and the potential strikes or future strikes are going to have on what's happening with ICE. So the fact that one of these protests in San Francisco on the 23rd was mostly comprised of different labor groups is also a pretty positive sign. So I know there's a lot of different things that I brought up there and a lot of stuff that has just happened within the past couple of days, but I'd be curious to hear just your thoughts on this whole situation, Dayton.
Well, I think going back to the first thing you're saying about the boomerang of imperialism, like I think it's like we're really seeing just how because like where we start with this, right? You see, all this stuff that's going on internationally, it really agitates people here, particularly this genocide in Palestine, right? The war on Gaza, right? It's really agitated a lot of people to take up, action. Often symbolic, but a lot of physical action's been going on for the last 2 years. There's really kind of brought a lot of these other contradictions in U.S. society to light and really brought them forward. And at the same time, the current administration has really been trying to do this crackdown, this ICE immigration, which as I see it is really just kind of a response of the declining U.S. economy, right? As the U.S. has overextended itself abroad, as the economic situation sort of deteriorates domestically, they have this need to really work to divide the ruling class, which a lot of what this ICE stuff is, And so on one hand, the stuff like this, these buffoons like this Shirley guy really play into that, It could have been anything. It could have been Shirley. It could have been some other right-wing hoax. It could have been QAnon, right?
Yeah.
That used to be a big thing not till that recently ago. And so, we see this, they really try to clamp down on the working class through these different ICE raids, try to divide them. But then as the solidarity movement grows, the state it kind of runs out of tools to divide people. I think it's interesting is just how these contradictions are so stark right now that even just particularly with the killings of Preti and Renee Good, the administration was so quick to just try to paint these people as domestic terrorists, right? As complete criminals, after it's quite obvious that they were just murdered. These were nonviolent people that were murdered by the state, right? And it's so obvious to people that that's what's happening. But you also just see how people are just so flooded by all the different things going on internationally. And so, it leads to these different sort of spontaneous outpouring of demonstrations. We had the so-called general strike on the 30th, just 2 days ago,
Hmm.
right here nationwide. And I think it was quite disruptive. But you see how the state really can kind of weather these things out, right? They wait a day, then
Hmm.
these shutdowns lapse. So I think what really is going to happen is that the state is going to continue these surges. They're going to continue killing people, and so the question is like, how is the solidarity movement going to respond? Right? Are we going to continue calling for like 1 day shutdowns?
Hmm.
What is the actual opposition that people are able to leverage to increase the heat here? Right,
Yeah.
because we see like how like different people have to respond to it. Right, the Democrats, even some of these more like sort of more hardline labor interests, are really getting behind some of these different shutdowns. It's been pretty inspiring, right? It really shows, I think, where like a lot of rank and file workers at. People want to take action,
Yeah.
but they don't know how.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a sign that the needle is being moved. The fact that what was it on the 23rd when the economic blackout happened, the national AFL-CIO came out in support of that, and that is something that I don't think we've really seen that much in the past. Given that we see that the head of a lot of these major labor units are actually pretty conservative. And working hand in hand with the ruling class in this country.
And anti-immigrant.
Yeah,
You
and
know.
very, very anti-immigrant for sure. But we see, like the rank and file in a lot of these situations are pretty radical, and they're looking to push things forward. And I do think the fact that these protests are happening is definitely a positive sign, but it's about trying to build on it beyond what we have now. And then I think some people have like um, as like, okay, these could be like small test runs in some ways, but I think it's about moving beyond the semi spontaneous to fully spontaneous to real coordinated, organized action. It's got to go beyond like, a lot of high school students and college students skipping class for the day, and like, I don't know, like 50 small businesses in the city closing shop for the day, and then a bunch of other ones getting bullied into making statements or making donations. It's got to be an actual coordinated effort that builds on this stuff. And I think it's, the misconception that some people have. It's just like, well, we can just withhold our labor and everything will work out. It's like, it's not really that simple, because a lot of people, they still got bills to pay. They still got mouths to feed. They still got a whole lot of other stuff that needs to be figured out, and that requires organization, that requires coordination, and that can't just happen like that.
Yeah. And I think, it's also like, how are we going to withhold our labor, right? It's like, yes,
Hmm.
we just need to withhold our labor. But, for the average person, that's it's still a very
It's a
abstract
tall
question.
task.
Well, it's so abstract because so many people
Hmm.
aren't doing these things as a part of some labor organization, right? They're
Hmm.
just saying, like, take the day off, right? Which, let's be frank, like, if just a bunch of people, calling in sick isn't a labor action, right? But most people are not organized into a labor union in this country, right? And
Hmm.
so I think I kind of chafe when I hear this idea of a test run because it's like without greater coordination, without a more clear idea of what we're actually working toward, we see that these things don't become test runs. They don't become
Yeah,
trial
that's
runs.
fair.
They just become flashes in the pan. Because even this current wave of demonstration, it hasn't, say, come to the same level when things were at around George Floyd, right?
Hmm.
But even then, like, I don't think the key thing is just like if we just get more and more people out in the streets. If we get more and more people out in the streets for just a day, that's still not going to actually pressure the government. If we get a bunch of people just coming out over a long period of time in a very spontaneous, uncoordinated, chaotic way, that's also not going to pressure the government. We can see how quickly the government was able to really co-opt so much of the so many of the George Floyd demonstrations, basically into opposition to Donald Trump to get Joe Biden elected. That was the big crux of like what the so-called left did around George Floyd demonstrations, was just co-opt it back into the system. And I think that's the big issue we have now. Is like a big issue now is putting all these different things on Trump and the GOP
Hmm.
versus seeing that it's both the Democrats and the Republicans are actually quite okay with this.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct. And, I think it is pretty apparent in a lot of ways, like the Democrats' response to it has been pretty flaccid. It's like their thing is like Tim Walz specifically said, it's like, oh, these ICE raids are okay, but they should just happen at night. you know,
Yeah.
or like the big thing is like, oh, they should be held to the same standard as police. That doesn't mean anything. They should have body cams, even though we've seen that body cams aren't actually effective, and it actually feeds into, this broader complex that's really about creating this, utilizing this military technology, and allowing for increased surveillance. It's like that doesn't actually lead to greater accountability and scrutiny and actual changes happening. It allows, it's like we've seen so many different videos of ICE agents, just like going up to people and being like, congrats, you're a domestic terrorist now.
Yeah.
Or even like the guy that shot Renee Good. He was filming the whole time.
Yeah.
And we can probably get that footage, but what good is that gonna do? And I think a lot of people see past this, but it's really about really trying to stress the point that this isn't just, a Trump problem. This isn't just like if Kamala was in power, like everything would be fine, because these would be the same types of quote unquote reforms that they'd be pushing for. And we've seen time and time again that reform isn't a real thing, when we're talking about the state, when we're talking about police in particular, in this regard. But yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's that big piece of consciousness that needs to be injected into the mass movement. That it's not just, there's not like a good politician office that we have to support to offset Trump, because there's like the section of the left of the establishment DNC left that says, oh well, we really got to support Tim Walz right now. Tim Walz is really being held hostage by the Trump administration. Trump is going to possibly take over control of the state from him. As okay, well, I mean, if Tim Walz is unable to fundamentally move against the Trump administration, even all right now, then what actually are we supporting, right? We're just sort of supporting the status quo, which is where everybody in power says they can't do anything to stop Trump, and that we just allow Trump to do what he's going to do. Like, that's the perfect cover for the United States, right? And so I think, being very clear that, that we have to, this whole state is actually guilty of this tactic. Even if Kamala Harris was in power, this would still be the same basic politic that the United States would be putting in place. It would look different, right? Trump ICE surges looked much different in the Obama administration than they did under the Trump administration, but they're both fucked up, right? They're both negative, and they were not in the interest of the working class. We can't just, we oppose Trump's ICE, but we're okay with an Obama ICE or a Kamala Harris ICE strategy. It's like, no, we actually oppose this method of class rule by the state overall.
Yeah, shouldn't just come down to like, okay, we see this in public, but if it's behind closed doors, we don't really care as much.
Yeah, if they do the raids at night, that's okay.
That is the position that some people take, but I think more and more people now, thankfully, are kind of getting their eyes open to the reality of the situation.
But it's like, also again, if they can't see anything to do with it, they just turn off, right?
Yeah.
They'll just turn off. We're not approaching any midterms now soon, I think. Was there some in June or some shit somewhere in some places?
It's coming up. I don't pay too much
follow
attention to elections and stuff, but
this is the type of stuff that's going to come back up in the cycle, like you're going to put forward other candidates. I mean, like we're already talking about like the crowded presidential race, I think Gavin Newsom, some people are entering the California governor's race now.
Well, I mean, all these people are taking different positions. It's like Gavin Newsom's like explicitly said it when he had Ben Shapiro on his podcast. It's like, oh yeah, my rhetoric around ICE was too strong. Yes, we need ICE.
Yeah,
Or even like, you look at like somebody like Saikat Chakrabarti who's like, yeah, abolish ICE. It's like, does anybody actually believe him when he says that? Because I don't, and there probably are people out there that do. But like I said, like this guy's supported dark money, astroturf politics in the past. Who's to say that doesn't continue when he gets in office? I would be surprised if he didn't keep acting that way if he got elected.
Yeah. And so much of the whole anti-ICE politicians, what they'll really say is like, oh, we just don't talk to ICE. We just don't cooperate with them. It's like, okay, well, you're going to stand in their way, or you're going to prevent them from actually doing their duties, right? Like, and so, like, if like folks are actually taking a principled stand against this oppression, that should be supported. But we should be very clear that the establishment politicians are not going to be the ones who do it. They're not going to be the ones who can lead the struggle. They shouldn't be, they should be following the demands of the mass movement. Of course, the mass movement doesn't really have any clear demands.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in these protests that we've seen in Minneapolis, they have been putting forth demands, but it's got to go, even further than what we've seen so far, which is just like single day actions, in
Yeah.
order to enact those demands. And, things are moving in the right direction, but I agree. It has to be, there has to be a higher level of coordination. There has to be a higher level of organization. And we just got to keep trying to get more people involved in a deeper way,
Yeah. All right, want to move on to talk about the
Yeah.
SF teachers?
Yeah, sure. We can get into that. Yeah. So another thing that's come up recently has been with these different strikes that have been happening in San Francisco. So there are two pretty important ones. One that's already started, one that looks like it's about to start. But just to frame this, we've seen within the past year there's been numerous cuts to different part of San Francisco's infrastructure and social safety net. San Francisco Muni has been facing a $307 million deficit, which could grow in the coming years. And that could result in a quarter of the agency's service being cut unless there's a public bailout or more funding allocated. We've seen cuts to Medicaid nationwide that could leave many people in the city in dire straits. Lurie's family zoning plan that could, if left unchecked, it would likely lead to another really devastating wave of gentrification against not just San Francisco, but the Bay Area's working class. When gentrification hits hard in one particular city, it affects the whole metropolitan area and the dynamics of it. It's not just isolated to cities or neighborhoods. And despite Denim Dan's talk about affordability during a State of the City address a few weeks ago, he's still more interested in courting billionaires and corporations than actually taxing them. He's actually come out against this, proposal for a statewide tax on billionaires. It's got a lot of people's feathers ruffled and threatening to leave the city, although we see how often this type of rhetoric comes up whenever anything like this happens, and how many of them are just bluffing. However, in a more positive note, we've seen this past week 31,000 healthcare workers in Hawaii and California go on strike against Kaiser Permanente. So this is the second time they've been on strike since October, and they've opted to go back to the picket line after negotiations broke down in December. So Kaiser has been attempting to intimidate workers into not striking by spreading misinformation and, pushing forth this idea about like penalties for going on strike. This is, pretty clear cut, just like anti-union, anti-strike propaganda that a lot of employers put forward. And so some of their demands are, the Kaiser union workers. They are more economic in nature, like workers demanding an end to unfair labor practices. They're, demanding that their right to free speech be recognized. They're demanding fair wages. They're demanding economic security as well as retirement and benefit security. However, something that has been even more positive than that has been the fact that the union is demanding, an end to employer-controlled pension going towards foreign companies and foreign investment. They're demanding an end to, Kaiser having connections to ICE detention centers and also their investments being made into predatory lending. Some union members have even stated more explicitly on the line in recent weeks that the reasons for striking aren't purely economic, but these more political demands as well, which is definitely a sign of things moving forward. And on the other hand, I think, another thing that we've seen coming up is that the local public school teachers union, UESF, is moving towards a strike in February. So if this does end up happening, it'll be the first time in half a century that the teachers union has gone on strike. So recently, 5,200 teachers voted to a tune of 97.6% to strike. Some of their demands include stuff like a fully funded dependent health care, wages increases, and as well as contract language affirming SFUHC's commitments for immigrants and to ensure that it's a sanctuary city. So earlier this week, it was reported that the district hadn't indicated plans to meet the requirements. They've said some stuff about like, oh, we'll give you like a 6% increase, and yeah, we'll recognize like we're going to give you these benefits, but a lot of this stuff isn't writing, and a lot of these union members are saying it's not enough. And definitely, if the teachers strike, this will definitely be pretty positive development. I think we've seen within the past half decade to a decade a lot of different nurses striking, but not this type of educators striking, at least in like public schools. And in our lifetime, really. So Yeah, I'd be curious to hear some of your thoughts about this stuff.
Well, I mean, the San Francisco Teachers Union hasn't struck for almost 50 years because they're rich. They're
Hmm.
pretty like teachers are all secretly rich. The administrators are all secretly rich. Like it's just like what I mean when I say that is that there's just like there's a particular class relationship there, right? In terms of the certificate staff, the non-certificate staff, right? Folks who are represented by the educators union versus the other labor organizations that are active within the school district, right? And so, what I think it's really kind of indicative is just like how the conditions in our society are getting so intense that even sections of the population that are at work are quite comfortable, actually. Even them are inclined to take a stand, right? And so we kind of just see how this extending sort of slump in the economy and like this growing disgust at the status quo is pushing whole sections of people that normally wouldn't take action have taken action. I was with the district for over 3 years as of last year. And then they had budget cuts last year, and I got laid off. I could go on and about different things going on in the district. But we had a couple different strike votes the last 3 years that never were able to meet that particular threshold. So I think it just shows this escalating contradiction going on in all of society. Actually, it's just like a slight microcosm.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think like it'll be interesting to see how this plays out over time. Like, I mean, I think it's definitely a positive development that the local teachers union is looking to strike. But it's also just a question of like what the union leadership is going to do over time. I think the thing that always frustrates a lot of people that I know that are union members is the fact that union leadership has a tendency to capitulate on these matters. And that's the thing that I think is like really stifled the labor movement time and time again. And so it's like, it's not, we don't see a large rank and file, working class centered labor movement in the United States. We see a very top down bureaucratic labor movement where people go on these semi symbolic 1 day, 2 day strikes. And then the leadership is like, well, this is as good as it's going to get. So deal with it. And that really frustrates a lot of people, and
Yeah.
that creates this downward spiral where people start to lose trust in their unions. They wonder if it's even worth it. That leads to declining union membership. That leads to less people trying to organize within the union. But I do think there have been some movement within the past few years of more rank and file members being like, well, screw you guys. Like, we need to actually do more. And it's going to take time and efforts and sacrifices for people to be able to do this. But I do think it is a positive sign that things are moving in that direction. But it's a lot of work, that's for sure.
Well, I think the key thing in this is that the issue is obviously with the bosses, is with the capitalists, but also with the union leadership. So then, is there
Yeah.
like efforts for workers to move outside of that? Because the way it
Hmm.
works with teachers is like this. So like, there's anger at the contract for not paying for enough things. There might be some concessions. The rank and file wants to go further. Union
Hmm.
leadership stops because that's considered to be unreasonable. Then they win the contract negotiations. They bully people to accept the tentative agreement. And then the following year after that, the district institutes budget cuts. Union leadership says, well, since we got more money in the tentative agreement, we can't fight budget cuts. And then that used to undercut further activism. So
Hmm.
see how like they work hand in hand to actually fuck over everybody at the end of the day. Like sort of some of the
Yeah.
certificate staff get like slight wage increases, but then they like use that as a justification to cut classes and shut down schools, create
Yeah.
more charter schools, and then ultimately lower enrollment, cut more teachers.
Yeah, no, I think that's like, very typical of what we've seen in a lot of different instances. The union leadership working hand in hand with the bosses in these
Yeah.
instances. Whether it is the state or whether it's the head of these different corporations. And they develop these tactics through a number of years. I mean, I remember reading about last year how I believe it was like the late 60s, early 70s, like how with like the auto workers in Detroit, how the union leadership specifically was working with these corporations and being like, hey, like if you take the union dues out of their paycheck, it'll be easier for us to leverage that over the workers, and so they'd be less likely to take more drastic, more meaningful action, and that's just something a lot of people take for granted nowadays. It's like, wait, like it didn't always used to be that way. It's like, yeah, it didn't always used to be that way. And that's just a small example. But this is, these types of tactics are things that have developed for such a long time that, a lot of people take for granted the fact that, like, the collaboration between these different, between union leadership and these different, bosses, heads of companies, is just a thing that happens, and it's a thing that we see even coming up when, in certain situations where folks try to, like, take over, and they're like, okay, we don't like the old leadership, so let's get our own people in, and then they end up acting in a very similar way, if not exactly the same, sometimes even worse because they have less experience and they don't know what they're able to actually do, but ultimately largely due to the fact that that's the only organization they're really a part of. It's just a union. It's nothing outside of that that's really trying to push for something greater, I feel like. But
yeah. Ready to move on?
Yeah, sure.
All right, cool. All right, so U.S. overreach abroad. So we're going to zoom out a little bit. So I think, since January 3rd, the United States has acquired a new neo-colony in the nation of Venezuela. So President Maduro still is sitting in a New York prison, while Delcy Rodriguez, his former vice president, is now the acting president. President Maduro is being held on drug trafficking charges, which I didn't know you could charge a foreign citizen with a crime, with a U.S. crime, right? Like, it's crazy. I think President Maduro, I think he pled not guilty and described himself as a prisoner of war during his when he gave some testimony a couple weeks ago. But we haven't heard so much about how he's been doing. And I just think, it's very, it's really important that we put that, how crazy that is, right? Like, imagine if Vladimir Putin kidnapped Volodymyr Zelensky, right, and then just like held him in a Russian prison, right? Like, internationally, we'd be the media would be going insane. And so, but going back on this neo-colony status, there's been some talk about the exiled opposition leader Maria Machado taking the presidency with U.S. backing. But it appears the U.S. is going to back Delcy Rodriguez, the former VP, because someone internal to the government right now is going to better control these different sections of the Venezuelan government, principally its military. And I think, that's important to really understand that this U.S. coup was fomented through assistance by the Venezuelan government, right? Everyone talks about the socialist, anti-imperialist government of Venezuela. Well, enough of these people were willing to cut a deal with the United States so that President Maduro is sitting in prison right now, right? And so Rodriguez is already implementing all these sweeping reforms. First of which is totally privatizing Venezuelan oil, as well as opening up the country to U.S.-led foreign direct investment. The U.S. is getting cuts of oil revenues now that they're selling internationally. And so I think that's the key thing here, is that the Venezuelans, the United States was able to broker this deal with the Venezuelan government to create it into a neo-colony without firing a shot inside of Venezuela, right? So the United States was able to bide its time and get actually the government itself to capitulate. Right. And so I think that's the big thing to understand about some of these different neo-colonial regimes, right? Or these different national regimes we see around the world. That without this clarity, we see the United States is really just able to cut deals with the ruling class at the expense of the Venezuelan population. Because the Venezuelan economy is only, in the Venezuelan masses are only going to, suffer if, like, now all this oil revenue is going to be immediately privatized. They're only going to suffer more if U.S. companies are coming in exploiting the people. These sanctions that they've had to deal with for several years have been incredibly crippling, but the replacement is like a total lack of its own sovereignty. And let's be frank, that this whole relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela really got to its rockiest point, specifically because Venezuela wanted to open up Venezuelan oil to other imperialist powers, right? They wanted to let in Russian and Chinese oil companies in. And that specifically is what led to the sweeping U.S. sanctions and condemnations, not, the so-called socialist government in place there. Particularly when they try to deal with other imperialists, which is a direct violation of the U.S.'s Monroe Doctrine. The United States will be the dominant imperialist power in the Americas and no one else, right? And so that's a key thing, right? And we see, them also widening that field now with what's going on with Cuba, For the longest time, the United States has led a series of different blockades upon Cuba, but in recent years has lifted different sections of this isolation. But even now, they're threatening to add blockades of oil imports as another pressure on the Cuban government. So it seems like they're also trying to use this opportunity now to further expand their control. And it's not just there. We actually see what's going on in Iran, right? So initially, we have these different waves of these different demonstrations going on in Iran. Initially Trump was claiming that he was going to intervene in order to support the nonviolent demonstrators. Now he's claiming that he's calling for the dissolution of Iran's entire nuclear program, and if they don't do that, they're going to invade. So it's like they're really like clamoring these they're really lining up the pieces as if they're going to do something in Iran. So I think this is something that we really need to pay attention to. The
Yeah, I
United States
mean,
has been moving troops through Iraq and Syria.
hmm,
It's pretty serious what's going on. And I think just the one thing about these nonviolent demonstrators, and I think that's really important. That while the sources outside of Iran have been pretty clear that there's something close to 5,000 people been killed in some of these demonstrations and counter demonstrations. But I think it's very important to understand like this is not just say like an Arab Spring type situation. That a lot of these like apparently like the stuff I've been looking to, there's been hundreds of police officers that have been like targeted and just like killed by so-called unarmed demonstrators who are clearly are armed. Right? There's been hundreds of mosques that have been burned down. Right? Like in targeted attacks. So obviously there are nonviolent demonstrations going on, but there's also a big section of actual like armed demonstrators that are going out and causing conflict out in the streets that the state is responding to. There's been all kinds of reports of possible involvement of Mossad, Israeli counterintelligence. And that's not just to say that every time that there's a disruption inside a non-aligned a country not aligned with the United States, it's all just Mossad, because that's actually falls upon some similar tropes we're not going to get into here. But it's very clear that this is not just the United States looking out for the best interests of the Iranian people. Even looking at like a lot of the opposition U.S. media right now against the regime in Iran, it all goes back to the Pahlavi family, right? The former disgraced Shah of Iran, right? Who's been given shelter in the United States, whose family still lives in the United States, still very rich, and claiming that the Iranian people would welcome U.S. intervention, would welcome regime change. And this is something we've heard already. And so, we see these dominoes sort of in place. We've going on with Venezuela. Now it's being create these openings to further pressure Cuba. We have these motions around Iran, and that's not even before we get into Greenland. But I know you wanted to chime in, Dale. So before we get into that, but
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think kind of like moving backwards a bit. The stuff with Iran is, I saw this a few weeks ago, and I would be surprised that the situation has changed since then. But they've had, Navy vessels off of the coast of Iran for some time now. Just ready to take advantage of the situation. And I think we see, um, yeah, the protests themselves. There are people that are not happy with the government. There are people that do want a regime change. But there's also other actors in play in this. I feel like, as with anything, ultimately the interests of the U.S. will look to do anything to destabilize a region. Even if there are some, organic elements to this discontent, they're also going to try and seed more discontent and division amongst people in these types of situations. So we'll see how it ends up playing out over time. Because I would be surprised if they're able to strike on Iran kind of similarly as they did to Venezuela. The stuff with like Venezuela, it's like it's kind of miraculous in some ways how they're able to do like a one evening kind of like situation where they just come in and then take out the president and then are able to get a foothold into it. And there's still a lot to be figured out in this particular situation. Some of it's kind of hilarious. I think there was that whole instance with like the ExxonMobil executive who was like, or the former ExxonMobil exec who was basically just like, yeah, I don't know if we want to like reinvest here because like our assets have been seized so many times. And then Trump was basically just like, well, screw you. Like, you're not going to get a piece of this anymore. And a lot of those, some of the talking points that people are trying to like propagate around this stuff is this idea that it's like, oh, well, see, the thing about Venezuelan oil is it's like so much denser than other oils. So it'd be like really hard to deal with. So it's really a question. Is this really what they're trying to do? It's like, well, first of all, yes, this is what the government has been explicitly saying they've been trying to do. They're not trying to hide the fact that it's over like elections and stuff or like socialism. It's the fact that they want this oil. And not only that, like if you look at actually in the United States, like what oil production facilities look like, they largely subsist on a mixture of these different forms of oils, probably like 70%, these like kind of denser oils that are harder to refine, you know, and these aren't things that you find in the United States. These are things that can only be gotten internationally, you know. And so it's like what the, you know, the what this tells us is in direct contradiction with like what some of these other kind of narratives that are being put out there by these execs or by these like, you know, different rags that exist that are basically trying to spin these like economic narratives about it being more complicated than it seems. You know, ultimately they're in it for the oil. And you know, even in the weeks before, in like a few days before Maduro was taken out of power, he was in discussions with the president in trying to figure out a way to fix things. But obviously, I think the thing was, you know, Marco Rubio was definitely pushing for a more direct intervention, which they succeeded in, and then suddenly he was out of power. But it's interesting, the stuff about Rodriguez. I definitely need to read more up on this. I haven't really kept my finger on it as much, but.
Well, yeah, I think it's the key thing, right? Because I think to say the United States invaded and kidnapped Maduro, I think is even like largely inaccurate. The United States cut a deal with a section of the Venezuelan ruling class to get the president to replace the president with a more pro-U.S. figure, which is this Delcy Rodriguez. It seems like it, right? And so it seems like that is the person that they're backing to like institute this new regime. We'll see how long she's able to stay in power, because usually the first lackey ends up getting gobbled up by another lackey. So we'll see how that situation develops. But like I think we have these two sides of the same coin of how the U.S. will try to like intervene. Either they're going to try to like cut a deal with the ruling class, in the case of Venezuela, or they're going to try to actually have an overt like total invasion, like is what some of the sword rattling around Iran is about. But I think we have to all see these different things, like the events in Venezuela, the events in Iran, the threats toward Cuba, and even the stuff as Greenland, around as an overall continuum of U.S. overreach, of U.S. imperialism. And not only that, but also U.S. inter-imperialist competition.
Yeah.
It's going back to the stuff around Greenland. And I think the first thing around like Trump's threat about Greenland is like we have to be very clear that this isn't a real thing. What I mean by a real thing is that I don't like Trump is not seriously trying to fly troops out and occupy Greenland and make it into another neo-colony. Yeah. That's not actually what's going on. A couple weeks ago, I think Sweden, Norway, and Germany sent a total of 35 soldiers to Greenland as a show of force. I think if that doesn't tell you how serious they are about what the U.S. is saying, then I don't think what else will, right? Like this, they're clearly this is actually a threat. But I think what I mean is that Trump does not like expect to own Greenland anytime soon, but rather he's using this political threat in order to rattle NATO and EU members and bring them closer in line with U.S. policy, right? So he wants to tighten its grip. The U.S. wants to tighten its grip over the Arctic Circle because it doesn't want to compete with Russia and China over more fuel reserves and other shipping lanes and trade with Europe, right? And so right now, international leaders are looking at what the U.S. is doing in Iran and the Americas, and the threats to Greenland seem very legitimate, right? And so the choice is either some brutal takeover, some like U.S. sanctioning, or cutting a more pro-U.S. deal, right? And so but we should realize that, this U.S. machine is very prone to overextension, and they're not the only imperialists in this game, right? And so the real risk the U.S. is facing now is further isolating itself when other powers like Russia and China have the ability to offer less aggressive terms, right? So it wants to dominate, the U.S. wants to dominate all these places, but it physically cannot occupy them all at the same time, right? And so, like, we look back at Venezuela, the U.S. considered military action and acted at some limited military strikes, but overall it waited until it could just unite with the right sellouts. So I don't think the United States is going to invade Greenland. They have been limited clear maneuvers. There have been limited. There's limited evidence that they're trying to do anything like that, right? So what the U.S. wants to do is wants to renegotiate its trade and political relations with EU members. And this threat, and the threat is like cut a deal or be invaded, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
thing now is like, is the other powers like China, for instance, right? I was looking at some stuff with Politico, and like a lot of these different cables are going back and forth between U.S., EU, and Chinese leaders, or ambassadors, I should say, is over like, what is this going to be? Like the EU doesn't want to cut ties with the United States, obviously, and wouldn't, right, over these overtures. But if China is able to use this, that's the real question: is China going to be able to use this to actually build a closer relationship with the European Union? And what is that going to do for the international situation? What we've seen is like, as historically, like when these different imperialist powers, as their competition increases, right, as one is able to gain up a leg over the other, it only increases international instability, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
then as the United States loses its position, it has no choice but to get more and more aggressive in other areas, right? So if Trump's gamble with Greenland ends up isolating the United States further from the European Union and allows for China to get in and build those relationships, well, then we're going to only see more Trump threats, more Trump militarism, more U.S. militarism.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the government's pretty ill-equipped to do another full-scale invasion, especially if it's a place like Greenland. I think it makes a lot of sense to me, in particular how they're just trying to use this as a way to renegotiate these different trade agreements and such. Because I just don't see it as like a realistic thing at all that they could do all these things in succession and be successful. For a number of reasons. I think part of it is they would be spreading themselves really thin. It would probably be the first time that there would be this type of intervention happening consecutively on this level. And I think part of it is like, I just don't even know if they have the manpower to be able to do it.
Not this year.
Yeah, not this year. It's like I think just like enlistment levels aren't at the level that they've been in past decades. And it's a lot more difficult to drum up support to get people to join, although they'll do their best to go to college campuses and get some dude to do pull-ups and be like, you should join the Marines and whatnot. But I don't think that's going to be so successful, especially while there's all of this, stuff happening with ICE domestically.
Yeah.
A lot of the people that they might try and send over there, they're probably, acting as ICE agents, and they would probably actually have to be trained a little bit to go do this stuff, because realistically, like a lot of the tactics that ICE are using in particular, if they were to try to do this stuff in an active war zone, they would just get blown up.
Yeah.
It's not even a question. They don't even, a lot of these folks, lack the very rudimentary training that people in the armed forces would require. And this type of discipline isn't just going to, dissolve overnight just because like, the president's like, oh, we need to shift all these people from this place to this place. It's like the military is the military. They have their shit figured out. There's a reason why they have these like standards and such, even if they do really terrible stuff, and
a terrible job.
Then they do a terrible job. They still have certain standards, even if those standards don't meet the same level of ethics and morality as most people would. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, like, I mean, if we go back like with the stuff with Iran. So, U.S. tension with Iran has been a thing in our U.S. foreign policy for over 50 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
So both countries, principally Iran, has been preparing for U.S. invasion for almost 50 years, right?
Yeah.
Like all our simulations, the U.S. military simulations, is that it would be quite abysmal. Right, it would be quite abysmal if the United States tried to occupy Iran the same way it's done to countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a very separate issue, right? I think they did the largest war simulation was over 15 years ago, and they estimated that something like 5,000 servicemen would die if the United States tried to invade Iran, right?
That was like the one they did during the Iraq War, right? So
yeah.
That was some time ago, but it's
ago.
still pretty accurate.
Yeah, it's still fairly accurate at a time when the country's war readiness was more high. So what it means is that, they're really hoping that they can foment some kind of internal a collapse of the government rather than just invade. And if they can do that, then they would rather do that, right? Because just a complete frontal assault, they're not able to do that. Least of all, not to do it next week, next month, next year even, right? So I think it's important to understand we have to see the social unrest in that larger context of all these surrounding forces. And if we look more clearly, it's just like the present war in Palestine, right? With the Zionists have been sending almost as many missiles over to the surrounding Middle Eastern countries as they have been to Gaza, right? Particularly with countering missile strikes coming from Lebanon and Iran, right? These are pretty. This is the United States, the Zionists have been pretty clear that the next focus is on Iran, right? And so we really should see that the United States is really trying to arrange all these different dominoes around that calculus. But again, like this isn't just in a vacuum. They're not the only ones who are trying to improve their position internationally. There's also the Chinese government that's really trying to portray U.S. aggression as justification for its own interference, right? And then the U.S. uses Chinese interference as a justification for over aggression. So we see how they one and one act together. So it's pretty dangerous stuff, and I think it's important that we understand that, particularly not falling into these sort of old Iraq war propaganda. As the United States, the peacekeepers of the world, and the United States need to be involved in this to protect the poor Iranians from their own government and give them a better government. We've tried, the United States has tried that in Iraq, or not tried to do that, did something totally different in Iraq that was unsuccessful, occupied Afghanistan for over 20 years and was overall unsuccessful. Was occupied Libya, was totally unsuccessful. Waged a war on Syria for several years, and was ultimately actually moderately successful with putting Al Qaeda in power there. This is only the basis for further bloody conflict, as long as these imperialist forces are just out there running buck wild.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it is pretty scary stuff. But I think we have to see that. That's why the need that we have to wage this anti-imperialist struggle. That's why the competency of our own domestic movement is so important, actually, so that we can actually educate people on what's going on around the world. Not just educate Iranians on what's going on, but educate American people what's going on. And it's until we actually have a very important responsibility as activists in the United States, that if we don't actually do something, the United States is going to continue doing awful things.
Pretty much.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is an interesting way to end episode 6 of the Rising Tide podcast.
Yeah.
But we'll have more stuff on this topic developing. We covered a bit more. We'll cover a bit more of these details in some of our weekly roundups. But yeah, if folks have any other questions or comments on this coverage today, please make a comment, shoot us a DM. We always want to get more feedback. Or if you have other suggestions of how we can cover this stuff better in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sticking with us for episode 6. Make sure to give this a like. Make sure to give us a comment, subscribe, share it with your friends, share it with your family. We really appreciate your feedback. We're also always looking for submissions, so if you have some thoughts about different stuff that we brought up or other things that we aren't covering, even if you want to just do an interview with somebody or, put together some other sort of piece, like a essay or something, we're always looking to put, different content out there and always looking for more submissions and stuff. Appreciate y'all for sticking with us.
Yeah, appreciate y'all. We'll see you next time.
All right, see you.
Laters.